When a school janitor sees a young girl stumble out of the bathroom, her eyes swollen with tears and her voice trembling as she utters three haunting words, he immediately knows this is no ordinary school incident. His heart sinks as he realizes that he is about to uncover a truth capable of shattering the school's pristine reputation. This is a story about courage, determination, and the relentless pursuit of justice, even when faced with overwhelming odds. Before we delve into this gripping story, let us know where you are tuning in from. If you stand for what is right, do not forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. The fluorescent lights buzz softly in the otherwise quiet hallway of Riverbend Academy. Harold Bennett, a 52-year-old janitor, methodically pushed his mop across the polished floor. The faint scent of cleaning solution lingered in the air, mingling with the distant sound of children laughing outside. It was a routine Harold had grown to appreciate, a rhythm that kept his mind occupied and brought him a sense of peace. But today was different. A sharp noise pierced the silence, a door slamming open, followed by hurried footsteps. Harold looked up just in time to see Lily Warren, a third grader with strawberry blonde hair, stumbling out of the girls' restroom. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was trembling, her small frame appearing as though it was about to collapse under an invisible weight. "Lily," Harold called out, concern evident in his voice as he left his mop behind and hurried toward her. The girl's gaze darted around the empty hallway before locking onto Harold. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she staggered closer. Her lips moved, forming words he could not quite catch at first. "Mr. Bennett," she gasped, clutching his arm as though it was her lifeline. Then she uttered three words that hit Harold like a punch to the gut. "He touched me." The words made Harold's heart stop for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. He crouched down to her level, his hands gently resting on her small shoulders. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Lily did not answer immediately. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Harold's mind raced as he held her, his protective instincts kicking in. Whatever had happened, he knew he needed to act quickly. "Lily, it is going to be okay. You are safe now," he said, steadying his voice despite the storm of emotions brewing within him. "Let us get you to the nurse." Carefully, he lifted her into his arms and carried her down the hallway. His steps were quick but measured. Harold pushed open the door to the nurse's office, where Karen Murdoch, the school nurse, was organizing supplies. She looked up, her brow furrowing as she took in the scene before her. "Karen, I need your help," Harold said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Something has happened." Karen rushed forward, her expression a mixture of concern and professionalism. Together, they settled Lily onto a small cot in the corner of the room. Karen knelt beside the girl, her voice soft and soothing as she asked, "Lily, can you tell me what happened?" But Lily only shook her head, clutching Harold's hand tightly as though it was an anchor keeping her afloat. Harold gently squeezed her hand, the weight of her earlier words replaying in his mind over and over again. "He touched me." Meanwhile, Karen continued trying to coax more information from Lily. Harold stepped back, his chest tightening. Memories of his own daughter, Emily, flashed through his mind, her laughter, her bright eyes, and the day she had been taken from him in a tragic car accident. The pain was still raw, even after all these years. He had failed to protect Emily, but he vowed not to fail Lily. Karen's voice broke through his thoughts. "Harold, we need to report this," she said firmly. "I know," he replied, his jaw tightening. "I will go to the principal right now." Leaving Karen with Lily, Harold made his way to Principal Greg Timmons' office. The short walk felt like an eternity, his mind racing with questions and doubts. Who could it have been? What had happened in that bathroom? And most importantly, how could he ensure Lily's safety from this point forward? Reaching the office, Harold knocked sharply on the door before stepping inside. Principal Timmons sat behind a large oak desk, his suit impeccably pressed, his posture composed as always. He looked up from his papers, raising an eyebrow. "Mr. Bennett," Timmons said, his tone clipped. "What can I do for you?" Harold wasted no time. "We have a serious problem," he said, his voice unwavering. "Lily Warren just ran out of the girls' bathroom in tears," she said. He hesitated, the weight of the words making them harder to say. She said someone touched her. For a moment, Timmons' expression remained neutral. Then, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing touched her. Are you certain that is what she said? I am certain, Harold replied, his voice steady. We need to investigate this immediately. Whoever is responsible. Let us not jump to conclusions. Timmons interrupted, his tone dismissive. Children can be imaginative. It is probably nothing, Principal Timmons said dismissively. Harold felt a surge of frustration boiling inside him. This is not nothing, Harold said, his voice rising slightly. She is terrified, Greg. We cannot just ignore this. Timmons sighed, leaning forward and folding his hands neatly on the desk. Mr. Bennett, I understand your concern, he said in a measured tone, but you are a janitor, not an investigator. Leave this matter to the professionals. The condescension in Timmons' voice felt like a slap to Harold's face, but he refused to retreat. I am not asking for much, Harold replied, his tone firm and unyielding. Just talk to Lily. Find out what really happened. Timmons shook his head, a faint, almost dismissive smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. I will handle it, Mr. Bennett. You can return to your duties. Harold clenched his fists, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. If you do not take this seriously, I will, Harold said, his voice low but resolute. The smirk faded from Timmons' face, replaced by a cold, hard glare. Careful, Mr. Bennett, he warned, his tone sharp and menacing. You are already on thin ice. Do not turn this into something it is not. Harold stared at him for a tense moment, his jaw tight. Without saying another word, he turned and walked out of the office. His mind was made up. If the administration refused to act, he would. As Harold walked back to the nurse's office, his thoughts turned to Lily. He could not shake the image of the fear in her eyes or the tremor in her voice. It was clear to him that this was far more serious than Timmons was willing to admit. Harold did not yet know how, but he was determined to uncover the truth and protect Lily at all costs. The hallways of Riverbend Academy felt eerily quiet as Harold made his way back toward the principal's office once more. The muted sound of his boots against the polished floor echoed in the silence, each step seeming louder than the last. His mind was swirling with a mix of anger, frustration, and determination. His earlier conversation with Timmons had been anything but productive, but Harold was not the type of man to back down, especially not when the safety of a child was involved. The principal's office was tucked away in the far corner of the administration wing, behind an imposing oak door with a polished brass nameplate that read, Principal Gregory Timmons. Harold hesitated for only a moment before knocking firmly. Come in, Timmons' authoritative voice called from the other side. Harold pushed the door open and stepped inside. Timmons was seated behind his massive desk, with stacks of papers neatly organized in front of him. He was impeccably dressed, as always, in a tailored navy suit and a perfectly knotted tie. His salt and pepper hair was combed neatly into place, and his piercing blue eyes regarded Harold with a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance. Mr. Bennett, Timmons said, gesturing for Harold to step further into the office. What brings you back so soon? I'd assumed this is about Lily Warren. Harold's jaw tightened. He had barely stepped into the room, and he could already sense the subtle condescension in Timmons' tone. Taking a deep breath, Harold squared his shoulders and fixed the principal with a determined stare. Yes, sir, Harold began, his voice steady. I have been thinking about what Lily said. This is not something we can afford to ignore. That little girl is scared out of her mind, and I believe we need to get to the bottom of it. Timmons leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as a faint, almost patronizing smile played at the corners of his lips. Mr. Bennett, he said slowly, I appreciate your concern, but as I mentioned earlier, children can sometimes be overly imaginative. It is entirely possible that she misunderstood something or exaggerated the situation. Exaggerated? Harold repeated, his voice rising slightly. You did not see her face, Greg. She was absolutely terrified. That is not something a child imagines. Timmons' faint smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. Harold, he said, his tone sharpening, you are a janitor, not an investigator. I respect your enthusiasm, but this is a matter for the school administration, not the custodial staff. Harold felt anger flash through him, but managed to keep his composure. I may be a janitor, but I know when something is not right, he said firmly. We owe it to Lily to take this seriously. At the very least, she needs to be interviewed by someone who is trained to handle these kinds of situations. Timmons' expression darkened and he leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. And I am telling you, Mr. Bennett, that we have protocols in place, he said, his voice clipped and commanding. There is no need for you to involve yourself any further. Harold clenched his fists at his sides, his frustration threatening to boil over. What protocols? He demanded, because all I have seen so far is a little girl in distress and a principal who seems more interested in sweeping this under the rug than finding out the truth. Timmons' lips curled into a sneer. Careful, Mr. Bennett, he said, his voice low and threatening. You are treading on very thin ice. If you continue to disrupt the school environment with baseless accusations, I will not hesitate to reconsider your position here. Harold stared at him, his chest tight with suppressed rage. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but he knew that losing his temper would only play into Timmons' hands. Instead, he took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. Is that a threat? Harold asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Timmons leaned back in his chair, the smirk returning to his face. It is a reminder, Mr. Bennett, of where you stand in this institution. Now, if there is nothing else, I suggest you return to your duties. For a moment, Harold remained still, the weight of Timmons' words hanging heavy in the air, but he could not shake the memory of Lily's tear-streaked face. Finally, Harold turned on his heel and walked out of the office, his steps measured but purposeful. As he made his way down the hallway, Harold's thoughts churned. Timmons might have dismissed him, but Harold could not let the matter drop. He would not. Every instinct told him that Lily was in danger. That evening, Harold sat in his modest kitchen, nursing a cup of black coffee as he stared at an old photograph on the table. It was a picture of his late wife, Laura, and their daughter, Emily. Emily had been just about Lily's age when she passed, a bright, spirited girl with a smile that could light up any room. Losing her had been the hardest thing Harold had ever endured, and not a single day went by that he did not think about her. He ran a hand through his graying hair, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. It was that weight, he realized, that made him so determined to protect Lily. He had not been able to save Emily, but maybe, just maybe, he could save another little girl from a nightmare. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Harold set down his coffee and went to answer it. Standing on his porch were Margaret and Andrew Warren. Margaret's face was etched with worry, while Andrew looked skeptical, his expression guarded. Mr. Bennett, Margaret began, her voice trembling slightly. We wanted to thank you for helping Lily today. She told us what happened, or what she could, anyway. Harold nodded and stepped aside. Come on in. We need to talk. Once they were seated in the living room, Harold recounted the events of the day, what had happened in the hallway, and his unsettling conversation with Timmons. As he spoke, Margaret's expression grew more alarmed, while Andrew's brows furrowed in frustration. This is unacceptable, Margaret said, her voice trembling. We trust the school to keep our daughter safe, and this is how they handle it. I am not surprised, Andrew muttered bitterly. Schools like these care more about their image than their students. Harold leaned forward, his gaze intent and earnest. Look, I do not know what is happening at that school, but I know Lily is scared, and I know Timmons does not want to do anything about it. If we are going to figure this out, we need to work together. Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. What do we do? I will keep digging, Harold said firmly. But you need to push the administration from your side. Demand answers. Do not let them brush you off. Andrew hesitated, glancing at his wife before giving a reluctant nod. All right, he said. But if we are going to do this, we need to be careful. They will try to shut us down if they see us as a threat. Harold gave a grim smile. Let them try. As the Warrens left, Harold felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not stop until Lily got the justice she deserved. What do you think really happened to Lily at school? And why is Principal Timmons so quick to dismiss Harold's concerns? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do not forget to like this video and stick around to see if Harold uncovers the truth. The early morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Riverbend Academy, casting long streaks of light across the polished floors. Harold Bennett pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway, his thoughts lingering on the previous night's conversation with the Warrens. The air carried the faint smell of disinfectant and chalk dust, but Harold barely noticed. "And I am telling you, Mr. Bennett, that we have protocols in place," he said, his voice clipped and commanding. "There is no need for you to involve yourself any further." Harold clenched his fists at his sides, his frustration threatening to boil over. "What protocols?" he demanded. "Because all I have seen so far is a little girl in distress and a principal who seems more interested in sweeping this under the rug than finding out the truth." Timmons' lips curled into a sneer. "Careful, Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You are treading on very thin ice. If you continue to disrupt the school environment with baseless accusations, I will not hesitate to reconsider your position here." Harold stared at him, his chest tight with suppressed rage. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but he knew that losing his temper would only play into Timmons' hands. Instead, he took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Is that a threat?" Harold asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Timmons leaned back in his chair, the smirk returning to his face. "It is a reminder, Mr. Bennett, of where you stand in this institution. Now, if there is nothing else, I suggest you return to your duties." For a moment, Harold remained still, the weight of Timmons' words hanging heavy in the air. But he could not shake the memory of Lily's tear-streaked face. Finally, Harold turned on his heel and walked out of the office, his steps measured but purposeful. As he made his way down the hallway, Harold's thoughts churned. Timmons might have dismissed him, but Harold could not let the matter drop. He would not. Every instinct told him that Lily was in danger. That evening, Harold sat in his modest kitchen, nursing a cup of black coffee as he stared at an old photograph on the table. It was a picture of his late wife, Laura, and their daughter, Emily. Emily had been just about Lily's age when she passed, a bright-spirited girl with a smile that could light up any room. Losing her had been the hardest thing Harold had ever endured, and not a single day went by that he did not think about her. He ran a hand through his graying hair, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. It was that weight, he realized, that made him so determined to protect Lily. He had not been able to save Emily, but maybe, just maybe, he could save another little girl from a nightmare. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Harold set down his coffee and went to answer it. Standing on his porch were Margaret and Andrew Warren. Margaret's face was etched with worry, while Andrew looked skeptical, his expression guarded. "Mr. Bennett," Margaret began, her voice trembling slightly. "We wanted to thank you for helping Lily today. She told us what happened, or what she could, anyway." Harold nodded and stepped aside. "Come on in. We need to talk." Once they were seated in the living room, Harold recounted the events of the day, what had happened in the hallway, and his unsettling conversation with Timmons. As he spoke, Margaret's expression grew more alarmed, while Andrew's brows furrowed in frustration. "This is unacceptable," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "We trust the school to keep our daughters safe, and this is how they handle it." "I am not surprised," Andrew muttered bitterly. "Schools like these care more about their image than their students." Harold leaned forward, his gaze intent and earnest. "Look, I do not know what is happening at that school, but I know Lily is scared, and I know Timmons does not want to do anything about it. If we are going to figure this out, we need to work together." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What do we do?" "I will keep digging," Harold said firmly. "But you need to push the administration from your side. Demand answers. Do not let them brush you off." Andrew hesitated, glancing at his wife before giving a reluctant nod. "All right," he said. "But if we are going to do this, we need to be careful. They will try to shut us down if they see us as a threat." Harold gave a grim smile. "Let them try." As the Warrens left, Harold felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not stop until Lily got the justice she deserved. What do you think really happened to Lily at school? And why is Principal Timmons so quick to dismiss Harold's concerns? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do not forget to like this video and stick around to see if Harold uncovers the truth. The early morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Riverbend Academy, casting long streaks of light across the polished floors. Harold Bennett pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway, his thoughts lingering on the previous night's conversation with the Warrens. The air carried the faint smell of disinfectant and chalk dust, but Harold barely noticed. His mind was busy replaying every interaction he had ever had with Principal Timmons, searching for signs he might have overlooked. The more Harold thought about it, the more convinced he became that Lily was not the only student who had suffered under Timmons' watch. He recalled snippets of conversations he had overheard in the teacher's lounge, rumors about Timmons' disciplinary methods being unusually harsh and secretive. At the time, Harold had dismissed them as idle gossip, the kind of chatter that naturally circulated in a workplace. Now those rumors felt more like puzzle pieces waiting to be put together. As Harold reached the end of the hallway, he slowed his cart and glanced toward Timmons' office. The door was slightly ajar, and Timmons was seated inside, speaking with a boy who looked no older than 12. The boy sat stiffly in the chair across from Timmons' desk, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Timmons leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate, but Harold could not make out what was being said. Not wanting to draw attention to himself, Harold quickly averted his eyes and continued pushing his cart. But as he passed, he caught a glimpse of the boy's face, pale and drawn, his nervous eyes darting toward the door. As if silently urging someone to come to his aid, a knot formed in Harold's stomach. He pushed his cart into the nearest supply closet and leaned against the wall, his mind racing. He could not ignore what he had just witnessed. Something was terribly wrong, and he knew he had to uncover the truth. Later that day, Harold found himself in the school's small, cluttered nurse's office. Karen Murdoch, the school nurse, was leaning against the edge of her desk, her arms crossed, observing Harold with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You are not typically one to linger," Karen remarked, her tone light yet probing. "What is on your mind?" Harold hesitated, glancing at the closed door before speaking. "It is about Lily Warren," he said. "You have seen her in here often, have you not?" Karen replied, nodding slowly. "Yes, she has been coming in quite frequently," she admitted. "Headaches, stomach aches, vague complaints. Nothing I could ever really pinpoint." Harold frowned. "Do you think it is just nerves, or could it be something else?" Karen sighed, her expression troubled. "I have wondered the same thing," she said. "But without any concrete evidence, there is little I can do. Children have bad days sometimes. It is hard to tell when it is something more." Harold leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What about other students? Have you noticed anything similar with them?" Karen hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she studied Harold's face. "Why are you asking me this?" she questioned cautiously. "Because I think something is happening," Harold replied. "I do not have proof yet, but I have seen enough to worry. Lily is not the only one who is scared. I have seen it in other children as well." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she did not respond. Then she let out a heavy sigh and nodded. "There have been others," she admitted. "Not many, but enough to make me wonder. A few years ago, a boy came in with bruises on his arms. He said he had fallen on the playground, but it did not add up. And there was a girl who suddenly refused to come to school. Her parents pulled her out a month later without explanation." Harold felt a surge of anger and determination. "Why did no one do anything?" he asked. Karen shook her head. "What could we do without evidence? It is all just speculation, and Timmons is not exactly the type to welcome questions." Harold nodded grimly. "I am not letting this go, Karen. Not this time. Lily needs us, and so do the other children." Karen studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right," she said. "I will help you. But we have to be cautious. If Timmons finds out, things could get dangerous." "I know," Harold said firmly. "We will keep it quiet." In the weeks that followed, Harold became a quiet but vigilant presence in the school. He carried a small notebook in his pocket, jotting down anything that seemed suspicious. A hurried conversation between Timmons and a teacher, a student leaving the principal's office with tear-streaked cheeks, a subtle look of fear in a child's eyes. At the same time, he and Karen began sharing their observations in secret, piecing together a troubling pattern of behavior. Tim's disciplinary measures often seemed to target the most vulnerable students, those who were nude, shy, or otherwise unlikely to speak up. And while there was no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, the sheer number of red flags was impossible to ignore. But Harold was not the only one paying attention. He soon realized that Timmons had begun to take an unusual interest in him. The principal's gaze seemed to linger on Harold longer than necessary during staff meetings, and Harold often caught him glancing his way in the hallways. One afternoon, while Harold was mopping the cafeteria floor, Timmons appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Bennett," Timmons said, his tone cordial, but tinged with suspicion. "How is everything going?" Harold straightened, keeping his expression neutral. "Just fine, sir," he replied. Timmons nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Good. I like to think we run a tight ship here at Riverbend. No room for distractions or unnecessary concerns." Harold met Timmons' gaze, refusing to look away. "Of course," he said evenly. Timmons smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Glad to hear it. Keep up the good work." As Timmons turned and walked away, Harold's grip tightened on the mop handle. He did not need to hear the words to understand the message. Timmons knew Harold was watching, and he did not like it, but Harold did not care. If anything, the principal's thinly veiled warning only strengthened his resolve. Whatever secrets Timmons was hiding, Harold was determined to expose them, even if it meant putting himself in danger. The school had long emptied for the day, and the silence of Riverbend Academy was almost eerie. Harold Bennett sat on a wooden bench outside the nurse's office, his hands clasped tightly together. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the corridor, but Harold barely noticed. His mind was fixated on what he needed to do next. Karen had assured him that she would continue watching for any further signs of distress among the students, but Harold knew the time for quiet observation had passed. He needed answers, and he needed them now. A soft shuffle of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Looking up, Harold saw Lily Warren standing hesitantly at the far end of the hallway. In the dim light, her small frame seemed even more fragile, her backpack hanging limply from one shoulder. She caught sight of Harold and hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Lily," Harold called out gently, his voice warm and inviting. "Come here for a moment, sweetheart. I just want to talk." Lily hesitated, glancing around the empty corridor before slowly making her way toward him. Her steps were cautious, as if she was afraid of being seen. Harold gestured for her to sit beside him. "It is all right," he said softly. "You are not in trouble. I just want to make sure you are okay." Lily sat down, her small hands gripping the straps of her backpack tightly. She avoided Harold's gaze, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Lily," Harold began, carefully choosing his words, "I know something has been bothering you. I see it in the way you carry yourself, the way you avoid looking at people. And I think it has something to do with Principal Timmons." At the mention of Timmons' name, Lily flinched. Her grip on her backpack tightened, and Harold felt a pang of sorrow at the sight. "You can trust me," Harold said gently. "Whatever is going on, you do not have to face it alone." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a barely audible whisper, Lily spoke. Harold had to lean in to hear her. He calls me to his office a lot. Says it is for counseling." Harold's chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "What happens in these counseling sessions?" Lily hesitated, her eyes darting around the hallway as if checking for eavesdroppers. He says I have to be a good student," she murmured. "But he stands too close sometimes. He touches my shoulder or my hair. It makes me feel weird." Harold swallowed hard, his hands instinctively clenching into fists. "Does he ever hurt you?" Lily quickly shook her head. "No, but I do not like it. I told him once and he got really mad, said I was being ungrateful." The weight of Lily's words settled heavily on Harold's shoulders. She was too young to fully grasp the implications of what she was saying, but Harold understood it all too well. "Lily," he said firmly but kindly, "you did nothing wrong. Do you hear me? Nothing. What he is doing is not okay, and I am going to make sure it stops. Lily looked up at him then, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Promise. She whispered, I promise, Harold said without hesitation. That evening, Harold stood outside the modest suburban home of Margaret and Andrew Warren. He had debated all afternoon about whether he should approach them, knowing that the conversation would be difficult. But Lily's trembling voice echoed in his mind, and he knew he had no choice. Taking a deep breath, Harold knocked on the door. A moment later, it opened to reveal Margaret Warren, a petite woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Mr. Bennet, she said, clearly surprised to see him. Is everything all right? Did something happen with Lily? Mrs. Warren, Harold began, his voice steady but serious. I need to speak with you and your husband. It is about Lily. May I come in? Margaret hesitated, her brow furrowing. Andrew, she called over her shoulder. Come here for a moment. A tall, broad-shouldered man appeared behind her, his expression wary. What is this about? He asked, his deep voice measured. It is about your daughter, Harold said. I believe there is something happening at the school that you need to know about. Margaret and Andrew exchanged a glance before stepping aside to let Harold in. They led him to the living room, where Harold sat on the edge of the couch, his hands resting on his knees. Margaret and Andrew sat across from him, their expressions a mix of concern and impatience. Lily has been coming to the nurse's office frequently, Harold began. She has been avoiding her classmates and seems troubled. Today, I spoke with her, and she told me that Principal Timmons has been calling her to his office for counseling sessions. Margaret frowned. Counseling? What kind of counseling? That is the problem, Harold said. She says he makes her uncomfortable, that he stands too close, touches her hair or shoulders. She is afraid of him. Andrew's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. Are you saying Timmons is being inappropriate with our daughter? I do not have concrete proof, Harold admitted. But based on what Lily told me and what I have observed, I believe there is reason for concern. I wanted to bring this to your attention because I know how difficult it is for children to speak up. Margaret shook her head, her face pale. I cannot believe this, she said. Lily never mentioned anything to us. She might not have known how to express it, Harold replied gently. Children often lack the words to explain what they are feeling. That is why it is so important to pay attention to the signs. Andrew leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Harold's. Why are you so invested in this, Mr. Bennet? You are just the janitor. Why would you go out on a limb for our daughter? Harold hesitated, the weight of his own past pressing heavily on him. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Because I lost my daughter, he admitted. She was only 8 years old. I was not there for her when she needed me the most, and I have been living with the guilt every single day since. I could not save her, but maybe, just maybe, I can help Lily. The room fell silent, Harold's words lingering in the heavy air. At last, Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Thank you, she said softly. Thank you for caring about our daughter. We will talk to her tonight and decide what to do next. Harold nodded, a small sense of relief washing over him. Please, he said, his voice steady. Be patient with her. She has been through so much, even if she does not fully understand it. As Harold left the Warren home that evening, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he was not fighting it alone. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Riverbend Academy as Harold Bennet began his shift. The rhythmic swish of his mop against the tiled floor provided a steady hum beneath his swirling thoughts. Yet his mind was far from the task at hand. Every interaction, every glance down a hallway, every shadowed corner now carried a weight of suspicion. Harold's focus had shifted. He was no longer just the janitor. He was a man on a mission, driven by Lily Warren's trembling words and the grim truths they had hinted at. Karen Murdoch, the school nurse, had proven to be a vital ally. That morning, she met Harold in the supply closet, pretending to check through inventory. Her face was pale, her voice low and cautious. I have been reviewing the school's medical records, Karen began, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Lily is not the only one. There are other girls who have come to me with vague complaints. headaches, stomach aches, things that do not quite add up. And they all have one thing in common: frequent visits to Mr. Timmons' office before they end up in mine. Harold frowned, his grip tightening on the mop handle. How many? 4, Karen whispered. But it is all circumstantial. I do not have solid evidence, just patterns. That is enough to keep digging, Harold replied firmly. Timmons is careful, but people like him always make mistakes. We just need to catch him in one. Karen nodded, her lips pressed into a determined line. I will keep looking, but I have to be discreet. If he finds out, Harold raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. I understand the risks. Leave the rest to me. In the days that followed, Harold became a quiet, watchful presence in the school. He strategically positioned himself in key locations, always keeping within earshot of Timmons whenever possible. He carefully observed every interaction, every extended pause, every meeting held behind closed doors. His efforts did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, as Harold wiped down the glass of the trophy case near the principal's office, Timmons emerged. His sharp gaze landed squarely on Harold, his voice dripping with condescension. Bennett, Timmons called, his tone cold and cutting. The science lab floors need scrubbing. Make sure you clean every inch this time. I noticed grime near the sinks yesterday. Sloppy work, even for a janitor. Harold straightened, forcing his expression to remain neutral. Yes, sir. I will take care of it. Timmons smirked, his eyes narrowing with disdain. Good. And while you are at it, the cafeteria trash bins are overflowing. Do not let that happen again. The exchange drew the attention of passing students, some of whom snickered at Timmons' tone. Harold met their glances with quiet resolve, his focus unshaken. He refused to let the principal's subtle attempts to undermine him derail his mission. Late one evening, long after the school had emptied, Harold found himself standing outside Timmons' office. The hallway was eerily silent, with the fluorescent lights casting a cold, sterile glow on the linoleum floor. Harold's pulse quickened as his eyes lingered on the locked door. He knew breaking in would be reckless and could cost him his job, or worse. But there was something about that office, something about the secrecy it held, that tugged at the edges of his thoughts. His gaze shifted to the principal's desk, visible through the narrow window in the door. Papers were neatly stacked in precise order, but one detail caught his attention: a small brass key resting on top of a folder. Harold's breath hitched. He had no idea what the key might open, but its presence felt too important to ignore. Before he could overthink it, Harold slipped a piece of gum from his pocket, unwrapped it, and pressed the foil wrapper carefully against the glass window. This would obscure his actions from anyone walking by. Then, using the handle of his mop, he gently nudged the folder closer to the edge of the desk until the key tumbled to the floor. Heart pounding, Harold crouched to pick up the key. It was small, unmarked, and unassuming, yet its presence in his hand carried a weight that felt impossible to explain. There was no time to linger. Harold pocketed the key and straightened, his mind already racing with possibilities. He could not afford to search the office now, not with security cameras in the hallway, but he was certain this key was the next piece of the puzzle in uncovering the truth. The next morning, Harold approached Karen in the nurse's office, his tone low and urgent. I found something, he said, pulling the brass key from his pocket and holding it out to her. Karen's eyes widened as she studied it. What does it open? I do not know yet, Harold admitted, his voice firm. But it came from Timmons' office. I would bet it opens something he is trying to keep hidden. Karen frowned, her concern written clearly on her face. You need to be careful, Harold. If he realizes you have this, I understand the risks, Harold interrupted, his voice steady. But this is no longer just about Lily. If he has harmed other children, we cannot let him get away with it. Karen nodded, though her expression remained somber. Let me know how I can help. Harold spent the rest of the day carefully planning his next move. He needed a strategy, something that would allow him to search Timmons' office without raising suspicion. The key was an important discovery, but it was also a liability. If Timmons noticed it was missing, Harold's precarious position at the school would be in jeopardy. That evening, Harold sat in his modest apartment, staring at the key resting on his coffee table. His thoughts drifted back to Lily's tear-streaked face, to the trembling words she had spoken that first day. He did not know what secrets awaited him behind whatever door this key opened, but one thing was clear. He would not stop until he uncovered the truth. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the school courtyard, where students and parents gathered for the annual spring fling. Brightly colored banners swayed in the gentle breeze, and the smell of popcorn and sizzling hot dogs filled the air. Laughter echoed from the inflatable bounce house near the playground. For most, it was a day of celebration, but for Harold Bennett, it was the perfect distraction. Harold glanced at his watch, his hands clammy despite the cool evening air. Karen Murdoch had assured him earlier that Principal Timmons would be occupied at the event, mingling with parents and overseeing the festivities. The window of opportunity was slim, and every second would count. Adjusting the cleaning cart in front of him, Harold double-checked its contents. It was carefully prepared to conceal his true intentions. Karen's voice rang in his ears, a memory of their earlier conversation in the nurse's office. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Harold? If Timmons catches you, I am sure," Harold had interrupted, his tone resolute. "This might be our only chance. We cannot let him cover this up any longer." Now, wheeling his cart down the empty hallway, Harold kept his focus sharp. As Harold left their home that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Warrens were on his side now. Together, they would bring Timmons to justice. But deep down, Harold knew the battle was far from over. Timmons was a dangerous man, and the fight ahead would test their resolve in ways they could not yet imagine. The morning air at Riverbend Academy was thick with unease, as if the school itself could sense the storm brewing within its walls. Harold Bennett stepped into the building with unwavering determination, his shoulders squared and his jaw set. In his pocket was the proof, the damning evidence that Margaret and Andrew Warren had already submitted to the school board. But Harold knew better than to trust bureaucrats to act swiftly. Time was of the essence, and he could not allow Timmons to continue hiding behind his authority. Margaret and Andrew had submitted the formal complaint to the school board earlier that morning, presenting the evidence that Harold and Karen had meticulously compiled. However, the response from the board was far from encouraging. Harold had overheard one of the senior members muttering something about avoiding unnecessary scandals and protecting the school's reputation. Their hesitation to take decisive action made it abundantly clear where their priorities lay. It was not about delivering justice for the students. It was about damage control. As Harold pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway, his mind raced with thoughts of what his next steps should be. He realized he could not solely depend on the board to act. He needed to take matters into his own hands and bring Timmons' actions to light himself. An opportunity presented itself sooner than he had expected. Near the main entrance, a group of parents stood in conversation with several teachers. Their voices carried a mix of polite laughter and casual chatter. Among them stood Principal Timmons, exuding his usual charm. His voice was smooth as he addressed the parents' concerns, putting on the confident, charismatic facade he always wore. Harold's blood boiled at the sight of him. How could this man, who had preyed on the innocent, stand there so smugly, so brazenly? Without hesitation, Harold approached the group, his presence immediately drawing attention. "Principal Timmons," Harold called out, his voice loud enough to rise above the chatter. The parents and staff turned toward him, their faces displaying a range of curiosity and confusion. Timmons' smile faltered for a brief moment before he quickly regained his composure. "Mr. Bennett," he said coolly, "I am rather busy at the moment." "If this is about your duties, this is not about my duties," Harold interrupted firmly. "This is about your actions. I know what you have been doing, and I refuse to remain silent about it any longer." A murmur rippled through the group as Timmons' expression darkened. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about," Timmons replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "If you have any concerns, I suggest you address them through the appropriate channels." Harold stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "You know exactly what I am talking about. Lily Warren, the files in your office, the students you have hurt. How many more children need to suffer before someone puts a stop to you?" Timmons' face turned a deep shade of red, his composure beginning to crack. "You are making baseless accusations, Bennett," he spat angrily. "This is slander, and I will not tolerate it." The tension in the hallway was palpable. The parents and staff who had gathered around watched the confrontation with wide eyes. Harold could see doubt flickering in some of their expressions, the seeds of suspicion beginning to take root. "Call it slander all you want," Harold shot back, his voice rising. "The evidence is out there. The Warrens have already presented it to the board. It is only a matter of time before the truth comes out." Timmons' eyes darted nervously around the group, his confident demeanor slipping further. "This man is a liar," he said, addressing the parents directly. "He has been bitter ever since I reprimanded him for his poor performance. He will say anything to damage my reputation." Harold felt a surge of anger but forced himself to remain calm. "You can try to discredit me all you want," he said, his voice steady. "But the truth is on my side, and when it comes to light, you will be the one who has to answer for your actions." By now, the confrontation had drawn even more onlookers. Quiet murmurs and hushed whispers filled the hallway as the tension mounted. Timmons, realizing the growing crowd, stepped closer to Harold. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper, audible only to him. "You are treading on very thin ice, Bennett." Timmons hissed. "Keep this up, and you will regret it." By lunchtime, the fallout from the confrontation had already begun. Harold was summoned to the administrative office, where he was met by a stern-faced HR representative who handed him a letter of suspension. The reason stated was vague: unprofessional conduct and creating a hostile work environment. Harold knew all too well that this was Timmons' doing. The suspension was nothing more than an attempt to silence him and tarnish his credibility in the eyes of the staff and parents. As Harold left the office, the whispers of his colleagues followed him down the hallway. Some avoided meeting his eyes, while others offered small nods of support. Harold held his head high, refusing to let their judgment weigh him down. He had anticipated retaliation, but it only strengthened his resolve. Outside the building, Harold found Karen waiting for him by the parking lot. She looked anxious, her hands gripping the strap of her bag tightly. "I heard what happened," she said softly, her voice low. "Are you all right?" Harold nodded, though his expression remained grim. "They believe they can silence me by suspending me," he said, his voice filled with defiance. "But they are wrong. This is far from over." Karen placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We will figure this out, Harold. You are not alone in this." As Harold walked away from the school, the letter of suspension crumpled in his grip. He could not shake the feeling that this battle was just beginning. However, one thing was certain: he would not stop fighting until Timmons was held accountable, no matter the cost. The first wave of backlash struck the very next morning. By the time the first bell rang at Riverbend Academy, whispers of the confrontation had already spread like wildfire. Outside the school, clusters of parents gathered in hushed discussions, their eyes flickering toward the administration building. The allegations against Principal Timmons had sent shockwaves through the foundation of their once trusted institution. Inside the Warren household, Margaret sat at the dining table, her phone buzzing relentlessly with messages from concerned parents. Some expressed support, while others struggled to believe that Timmons could be guilty. Many were unwilling to accept such a horrifying truth. Andrew, pacing behind her, clenched his fists. "We cannot let this die as mere whispers," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "We need to take this public." Margaret nodded in agreement. "I have already contacted a local journalist," she replied. "They are interested in the story, but they need more than just our statement. They need solid proof, as well as people willing to speak on the record." That afternoon, Karen Murdoch sat alone in her car in the parking lot of a small coffee shop. Anxiety gnawed at the edges of her nerves as she clutched her phone, debating the risk of what she was about to do. Finally, taking a deep breath, she dialed the number of a journalist known for exposing local corruption. "I have information about Riverbend Academy," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But I must remain anonymous." For the next 30 minutes, Karen carefully detailed everything she and Harold had uncovered. She chose her words cautiously, ensuring she did not reveal anything that could trace the tip back to her. The reporter pressed with precise, pointed questions, and Karen answered as thoroughly as she dared. When the call finally ended, her hands were trembling, but a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had taken a critical step to ensure that the truth could not be buried. Meanwhile, Harold sat in his modest living room, his notebook open on the coffee table. The suspension had given him time to reflect, but he could not afford to remain idle. He flipped through the pages, scanning his detailed notes, his carefully recorded observations and timelines staring back at him. He needed more than documentation to push the school board into action. He needed allies. As if on cue, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "This is Harold." The voice on the other end was hesitant yet resolute. "Mr. Bennett, my name is Rachel Harper. I'm a former student of Riverbend Academy." There was a pause, and Harold could hear the tremor in her voice. I heard about everything that is happening," she continued. "I think it is time I come forward." Harold felt his breath catch. "Rachel, are you saying I have been waiting for years for someone to expose him?" she interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "He did the same to me. I was too afraid to say anything back then, but I am not afraid anymore." The following morning, Rachel Harper sat across from Harold, Margaret, and Andrew in a quiet corner of the community center. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a can of soda, her eyes fixed downward. "I was 10 when it started," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He would call me to his office for detention, for special counseling. At first, it was just compliments that never felt right. Then it escalated." Margaret reached across the table and gently placed her hand on Rachel's arm. "You are incredibly brave for speaking up," she said, her voice warm and reassuring. "Your story will make a difference." Rachel nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I have carried this for so long. If it can help protect other children, I will do whatever it takes." Andrew leaned forward, his tone serious. "Are you willing to speak with the media? We are working with a journalist who is already investigating, and your testimony could be the tipping point." Rachel hesitated, the weight of her decision evident in her expression. Finally, she took a deep breath. "I will do it," she said. "But I want to remain anonymous, at least for now." As the week progressed, the story took on a life of its own. Local news outlets picked up the allegations, their headlines sending shockwaves through the community. "Scandal at Riverbend Academy. Principal accused of misconduct" dominated the airwaves and flooded social media feeds. Parents began to take sides. Some rallied around the Warrens, their outrage fierce as they demanded accountability. Others, fiercely loyal to Timmons, dismissed the accusations as nothing more than a malicious smear campaign. PA meetings turned into battlegrounds, voices raised in heated debates, accusations flying from both sides. The once close-knit community of Riverbend Academy was fracturing under the weight of the truth. Karen observed the unfolding drama from the sidelines, caught between a sense of relief and an underlying dread. The attention was necessary to drive change, but it also brought an increased level of scrutiny. She received anonymous messages of support from staff members who were too afraid to speak out. Yet at the same time, she felt the icy stares of those who blamed her for damaging the school's reputation. For Harold, the backlash was both a validation and a challenge. He received calls from parents expressing gratitude for his courage, but he also became the target of hostility. One evening, as he pulled into his driveway, his heart clenched at the sight of bold red graffiti scrawled across his garage door. Liar, he stood there for a moment, the message igniting something deep within him. He knew the truth. He was not a liar, and he refused to let fear or intimidation silence him. As Harold scrubbed the hateful words off his garage, his phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. "Rachel's interview airs tonight at 6. I thought you would want to know." Harold allowed himself a small smile. The truth was surfacing, piece by piece, and with every new revelation, the polished facade that Principal Timmons had built was beginning to crack. The final blow came that evening when Rachel's voice filled the airwaves. Though her face was blurred and her name withheld, her words carried undeniable weight. "I remained silent for too long," she said, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "No child should ever have to endure what I did. It is time for the truth to come out." The segment ended with a statement from the journalist. "This is only the beginning of our investigation into Riverbend Academy. We will continue to follow this story closely." For the first time in weeks, Harold allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. The walls around Timmons were closing in, and the combined strength of the community, parents, students, and those who had dared to speak out, was proving to be a force he could not ignore. Harold was no longer fighting for Lily alone. He was fighting for every child who had ever been silenced, and he was determined to see this through to the very end. The sun had barely begun to rise when the first unmarked police cars pulled into the parking lot of Riverbend Academy. Their arrival was swift and silent, a stark contrast to the storm they were about to unleash. Standing on the sidewalk across the street, Harold Bennett crossed his arms tightly over his chest. Karen stood beside him, her expression tense but resolute. They both knew this moment had been a long time coming. The investigation had gained significant momentum after Rachel Harper's testimony aired. Public outrage reached a breaking point, with parents demanding immediate action. Under immense pressure, the school board had no choice but to authorize a formal inquiry into Principal Timmons' conduct. Law enforcement was brought in to ensure that the process was thorough and impartial. Harold exhaled slowly as officers entered the building, accompanied by board members and the lead investigator, Detective Lisa Grayson. She was a sharp-minded, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for cutting through bureaucratic red tape. Harold had met with her just the day before, providing his notes and recounting everything he had witnessed. Her firm assurance that the investigation would be exhaustive had been the only thing keeping him grounded since. Inside the school, an uneasy tension settled over the hallways. Teachers whispered in hushed voices while students watched in wide-eyed curiosity as officers moved methodically through the building. Principal Timmons remained inside his office, his usual air of authority now tinged with visible discomfort. He had been summoned for a meeting with the investigators, but he refused to leave his chair without a direct order. When Detective Grayson finally entered his office, she was flanked by two officers. Her tone was professional but firm. "Mr. Timmons, we are here to execute a search warrant for your office and personal files. Please step aside." Timmons rose slowly, his jaw clenched tight. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Do you have any idea how much damage these baseless accusations are doing to my reputation? To my career? Your cooperation will only help expedite this process." Grayson interjected, unfazed by his outburst. "If there is truly nothing to hide, you will have the opportunity to clear your name. But for now, I need you to step over there." She gestured toward a spot by the door. With clear reluctance, Timmons complied, his face red with barely contained fury. The officers wasted no time. Filing cabinets were opened, desk drawers were searched, and even the locked storage closet, the very one Harold had once broken into, was examined. Within minutes, the walls that Timmons had carefully built around himself began to crumble. They uncovered folders filled with photographs and handwritten notes, evidence far more damning than anyone had expected. Grayson pressed her lips into a thin line as she examined the contents. She turned to one of the officers. "Bag and tag everything. We will need forensic analysis." Timmons, now visibly shaken, attempted to protest. "This is all a misunderstanding," he stammered. "Those files are confidential student disciplinary records." Grayson's gaze remained steely. "They will be reviewed under the appropriate protocols," she replied sharply. "You will have your chance to explain." Tension reached its peak later that afternoon when Timmons was led out of the school in handcuffs. The sight was surreal. A man who had once commanded both fear and respect now reduced to a figure of public disgrace. Students lined the hallways, their whispers growing louder as they grasped what was happening. Teachers tried in vain to maintain order, their own shock evident in their expressions. Outside, a small crowd of parents and community members had gathered. Some jeered, while others watched in stunned silence. Harold stood among them, his hands clenched at his sides. Karen stood at his elbow, her face pale but resolute. Margaret and Andrew Warren were there too, their arms wrapped protectively around Lily, who clung to her mother's side. As Timmons was placed into the back of a police car, his gaze briefly met Harold's. For a moment, it seemed as if he might say something, but instead, he turned away, his shoulders slumping. Harold felt no triumph in the man's downfall. There was no victory here, only a grim sense of justice finally being served. In the days that followed, the fallout from Timmons' arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The school board came under intense scrutiny as parents demanded to know how such misconduct had been allowed to persist for so long. emergency meetings were held, with board members vowing to implement sweeping reforms to ensure student safety. One of the first actions taken was the immediate suspension of staff members who had knowingly turned a blind eye to Timmons' behavior. Several teachers and administrators were placed on leave pending further investigation. Eileen, the school secretary who had often looked the other way, chose to resign before disciplinary action could be taken. I did not know the full extent of it, she admitted tearfully during her resignation announcement. But I should have done more. I should have seen the signs. Karen, who had risked everything to expose the truth, became a quiet hero among parents and staff. Her bravery was acknowledged at a community meeting, where several parents stood to publicly thank her for her courage. Harold, too, was met with a standing ovation when Margaret spoke of his relentless determination to protect Lily and uncover the truth. For Harold, the victory was bittersweet. He had accomplished what he had set out to do, but the cost had been steep. His suspension from Riverbend Academy was now permanent, and he knew his name would forever be tied to the scandal that had shaken the town. Still, as he sat on the porch of his modest home one evening, he felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. The warm golden light of late afternoon filtered through the windows of the Warren household, casting a soft glow over the living room. Lily sat cross-legged on the couch, a blanket draped over her lap as she worked on a colorful drawing. In the kitchen, Margaret and Andrew watched her quietly, their voices low as they spoke about the progress she had made in therapy. "She is stronger than I'd ever imagined," Margaret said, her voice filled with both awe and relief. "Dr. Phillips says it will take time, but Lily is already opening up more than expected." Andrew nodded, his gaze resting on their daughter. "We owe Harold everything," he said, but his voice faltered before he could finish. The weight of what could have been lingered between them like a shadow. But the relief of what was, Lily, safe, healing, and surrounded by love, was enough to keep the darkness at bay. A knock at the door broke the moment. Margaret smiled, already knowing who it was. She crossed the room and opened the door to find Harold Bennett standing on the porch, a warm yet humble smile on his face. In his hands, he held a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for the family. "Harold, come in," Margaret said, stepping aside to let him enter. "You did not have to bring anything." "It is just a little something," Harold replied, handing her the plant. "Thought it might brighten up the place." Lily's face lit up the moment she saw Harold. "Mr. Bennett," she exclaimed, leaping off the couch and running straight into his arms. She wrapped her small arms around his waist, her frame trembling with excitement. "Hey there, kiddo," Harold said softly as he returned the hug. "How is my favorite artist doing?" Lily beamed up at him. "I have been drawing a lot. Do you want to see?" "Of course," Harold said, allowing her to tug him toward the couch. She eagerly showed him her latest creation, a vibrant drawing of a superhero standing tall, a flowing cape billowing behind them. The figure bore a striking resemblance to Harold, down to the flannel shirt and kind eyes. Harold chuckled, though he felt a lump forming in his throat. "Is that supposed to be me?" he asked. Lily nodded enthusiastically. "You are my hero." Harold blinked back the moisture in his eyes, humbled by the child's unwavering gratitude. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know," he said, his voice warm, "real heroes are the ones who keep going even when things get tough. That is you, Lily." As the evening wore on, the Warrens and Harold sat together in the living room, their conversation flowing easily. Margaret shared updates on Lily's progress in therapy, while Andrew spoke about the reforms being implemented at Riverbend Academy. The school board had adopted new policies to ensure stricter oversight, and several staff members had been replaced. "They even asked me to come back," Harold said, his tone reflective. "Offered to make me head of facilities if I wanted the job." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And?" Harold smiled faintly. "I turned them down. I think it is time for me to move on. This whole ordeal reminded me why I took this job in the first place. I wanted to protect kids, to make a difference, and now I feel like I have done that." Andrew nodded in understanding. "You deserve to rest, Harold, but I hope you know, you will always have a place in our family." Harold glanced at Lily, now curled up beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I think I already do," he said softly. As the evening turned to dusk, Harold prepared to leave. Lily walked him to the door, her small hand tucked in his. "Will you come visit again?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. "Of course," Harold assured her. "Anytime you need me, I will be here." Lily smiled, her trust in him unwavering. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Bennett." Harold crouched down to her level, looking her in the eye. "You do not have to thank me, Lily," he said. "Just promise me one thing." "What is that?" she asked. "Promise me you will keep being brave," Harold said, his voice gentle. "And keep drawing. The world needs more of your art." Lily nodded solemnly. "I promise." As Harold walked to his car, he paused for a moment, taking in the quiet beauty of the evening. The first stars had begun to emerge, faint pinpricks of light against the darkening sky. For the first time in years, Harold felt a deep sense of peace. He had honored his late daughter's memory by protecting Lily, and in doing so, he had found a measure of closure. The fight for justice had left its scars, but it had also strengthened bonds, mended wounds, and illuminated a path forward. Harold knew the road ahead would not be easy for Lily or for her family. But he also knew they had the strength to face whatever came next. As he climbed into his car and drove away, a rare smile crossed his face. He was not just leaving behind a job. He was leaving behind a legacy, one built on courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that doing the right thing was always worth the fight. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like. And if you have not already, subscribe for more.